event. And just a few quick notes before we get started with the good stuff. We are recording this event. Everyone's going to come in muted, so there's no need. Only the people who are in the little yellow box unmuted will be the ones being recorded. And thank you for your support. And also, please type any questions you have for our author in the chat box and throughout the evening, and we will store them up and get to them at the end. Let me hand things over to my wonderful colleague, Rachel.
Hi there, I'm Rachel Person. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. And I'm thrilled to see all of you here tonight for this great event. Tonight, I am so incredibly pleased and proud to welcome Russell Banks to Northshire Live to talk about his new book, FOREGONE. A new book by Russell Banks is always an exciting moment for all of us at Northshire. He's one of America's most treasured literary fiction authors and a loyal, longtime friend to the store. His novel Cloud Splitter lives in my personal pantheon as the first book that really showed me the emotional depth that can be achieved in historical fiction. It's such an honor to be celebrating with him tonight. Russell will be interviewed tonight by another great friend of the Northshire, Joe Donahue, who is the Vice President of News and Programming for WAMC Northeast Public Radio and host of the Roundtable, which airs from 9 a.m. to 12 noon on weekdays. Joe has interviewed a true catalog of literary and political guests, basically everyone, and has been honored with over 50 national and local awards for his interviewing achievements. Please join me in welcoming them to Northshire Live, and Russell's going to kick us off with a short reading from his novel.
Good. Well, thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here again, and a pleasure to be with Joe Donahue, also, who I've done interviews with in the past, and always enjoy it. I'd like to just read a couple of pages, a very short reading, not even 5 minutes, maybe at the most here, that kind of sets up the novel. It's at the end of the first chapter. There are 22 chapters, and it's the end of the first chapter, and it should lead you then into the novel. A man who is the center of the book, Leonard Fife, who is an acclaimed Canadian-American leftist documentary filmmaker, is dying of cancer in his late 70s in his home in Montreal with his wife, Emma, and a film crew that is there to film his final interview. Slightly macabre intention, perhaps, but also a way of wrapping up his life in a public way. And this is so there's a cameraman, there's a sound person, there's a producer, and there is the director who was named Malcolm, who was an acolyte of Leonard Fife's and a student of his in Canada when he was teaching in Montreal. And this is all taking place in the home of Leonard Fife in Montreal. So when I say Malcolm, that's the director, the younger director, who was an acolyte and student of Leonard Fife. And then there's a reference or two to, I think, to Emma, who is his wife now. Malcolm says Fife's name and the date, April 1, 2018, and location, Montreal, Quebec, and claps his hands once in front of Vincent's FS7. The camera is attached to a tripod on a track that orbits the circle of light on the bare floor and stares at the featureless flat black side of Fife's face like the dark side of the moon. The unseen side is lit by the overhead spot. His silhouette has a molten golden edge, a penumbra surrounded by impenetrable black space. Malcolm is right. Fife still has a brooding, beautiful, bald head, at least in profile. The illness and chemo have dissolved a quarter of his body, liquefying his flesh, pushing forward the long arc of his nose and his cheekbones and prominent chin and the plates of his skull. He looks like a polished Roman coin. For a few seconds, everyone is silent, waiting for Malcolm's first question. But suddenly Fife says that he's going to answer a question that no one knows to ask today. The question, he says, is simply this: Why did you decide in the spring of 1968 to leave the United States and migrate to Canada? For nearly 50 years, he's been answering that question, creating and reaffirming the widespread belief, at least among Canadians, that Leonard Fife was one of the more than 60,000 young American men who fled to Canada in the late 1960s and early 1970s in order to avoid being sent by the US military to Vietnam. Those 60,000 men were either draft dodgers or deserters. For half a century, Leonard Fife was believed to be a draft dodger. It's what he claimed on the day he crossed the border from Vermont into Canada and asked for asylum. He's claimed it ever since that day. The truth, however, as always, is more complicated and ambiguous. Therefore, consider the preceding as merely a preface. For here begins Malcolm McLeod's controversial film, Oh, Canada. Although brilliantly shot and edited by McLeod and produced by his wife Diana in the late Leonard Fife's own manner, it is in some ways a disheartening, disillusioning film about Fife, one of Canada's most celebrated and admired documentary filmmakers. Oh, Canada shocked and disappointed the millions of Canadians who admired Leonard Fife for being one of those 60,000 Americans who fled north in the late 1960s to escape being sent by the American government to kill or die in Vietnam. While his filmed deathbed confession may have been cathartic for Fife himself, it has brought many Canadians to question their past and present national policy of offering asylum to so-called refugees. Refugees are people who have fled their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution if they return home. They are assumed to have seen or experienced many horrors. A refugee is different from an immigrant. An immigrant is a person who chooses to settle permanently in another country. Refugees are thought to have been forced to flee. Leonard Fife claimed to be a refugee.
Russell Banks.
The first chapter.
Yes, Russell Banks reading from the new novel FOREGONE, which is published by Echo. Well, it is so nice to speak to you. Before we get started, if you don't mind, and I'm going to do a formal introduction for our show, and then we'll talk for about a half hour, and then we have wonderful people who have questions already. And if you have one, you can add it to the chat box, and we'll get to them in a little bit. So here we go in 3, 2, and 1. Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Russell Banks, twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, joins us this week to discuss his new novel, FOREGONE. In the novel, we meet Canadian-American leftist documentary filmmaker Leonard Fife, one of 60,000 draft evaders and deserters who fled to Canada to avoid serving in Vietnam. Fife, now in his late 70s, is dying of cancer in Montreal and has agreed to a final interview in which he is determined to bare all his secrets at last, to demythologize his mythologized life. This show is recorded as part of a virtual author event with Northshire Bookstore, northshire.com. A prolific writer of fiction, Russell Banks' titles include The Darling, The Sweet Hereafter, Cloud Splitter, Rule of the Bone, Affliction, Success Stories, and Continental Drift, just to name a few. It is a great pleasure to welcome our dear friend Russell Banks back to the Book Show. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, Joe. It's great to see you, even virtually.
Well, it's wonderful to see you. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this novel. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. And I find what I enjoyed so much about it is I don't know the last time I enjoyed a book so much about a character who is really fairly despicable.
And I know that's the risk I took, I think, with it. But it's been true. So many of my protagonists over the years, they're the kind of people you would like to judge, and in some ways dismiss, and not have to think about, and not have to humanize in any way. But those are the people I'm most attracted to, and that's sort of the work that I try most to do, is to take a character like Leonard Fyfe, who is morally compromised through most of his life, and is trying desperately at the very end of his life to find a way to redemption, find a way to redeem himself from the many sins. They aren't crimes, but many sins that he has committed over his life. And the only way he can imagine doing it, I suppose, is to be a character in a novel by Russell Banks. But that's what's happened. But you think of Nick, of Bob Du Bois in Continental Drift, and who's similarly flawed, and John Brown in Cloud Splayer, or Wade Whitehouse in Affliction, and so on. I mean, these are characters who are profoundly, deeply, and in some ways frighteningly flawed, and yet it's important to humanize them, to find a way to see their humanity, and for them to find a way to see it themselves, in themselves, I think. And Leonard Fyfe is sort of in that tradition, I guess.
So this is really for him a deathbed confessional of telling people what really ultimately his wife, the truth. And he sees it as his last chance. And there's a documentary film crew, and they want him to tell one story, one set of stories, and he wants to tell a completely different set of stories, which basically is to set his record straight.
Right, and he's telling the story in a way that doesn't make sense to the listeners. This was the structural problem and difficulty with the book in some ways, was how can I let a man tell his story in a way that is true to his own subjective experience when the man himself is addled, his brain is addled by illness, he's dying of cancer, by medication, by age, and how can I reveal in a novel what he experiences subjectively, and also reveal in contrast to that what is being heard by and filmed by these more objective and detached listeners, the filmmaker and his producer and his sound person and his cameraman, and most importantly, his wife. So it alternates back and forth between the two narratives. And one narrative is the subjective experience of Leonard Fyfe as he recalls his life, and it's how he recalls it. It's not how he's saying it, however, or how he's revealing it to the camera. And the other is the response of the camera crew and the director as they're listening to him, and it's not quite making sense. It's not quite cohering for them. And it's certainly in stark contrast to the kind of questions they had already raised.
Which makes it so fascinating, because they're continually, the people in the room are continually asking him, guiding him in some ways, asking him, did that really happen? Or perhaps you can tell us more about this. He's having a regular running conversation with his wife. I want to tell you this. And she said, well, I know what I need to know. I don't really need to know anything else. I wondered, to write that, you said there were challenges. Did you make the decision that you had to know what the truth was before you could hear his version of it?
Gee, that's a tough question. It's a good one. How much did I know about his story before I got him to tell it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because it's so gauzy in places, and it skips. So do you have to know and have the structure of what it is, or do you want to be like us in the sense of not really sure as to where all those pieces are?
I think I had to invent it as I went along to a large degree. I knew the rough outline of it. I mean, from the first chapter, he's going to die by the end of this book. it's not exactly a secret.
Spoiler alert.
and you know he's going to be revealing some unseemly truths that are going to run counter to his publicly perceived persona. And you know that. I knew that much certainly at the beginning. I also knew that I was going to take him back to a lifetime of personal abandonments of responsibility, and more particularly of an inability. I was going to take him back to an inability to properly love the people who loved him. In the end, it's a book about love, and about the difficulty of it, and the need at the end of life to somehow understand that and try to express that when you have spent most of your life in denial of that, and most of your life, in effect, betraying that.
You write later in the novel, it is another reason for wanting Emma there. She is the only one who can bridge the gap between his memories and his description of them, as if he is speaking in a language that only she and he understand. He and Emma are his brain's only native speakers. This is love, is it not? That is a beautiful line. That idea that those two are the only native speakers of that brain.
Yeah, that's terribly important to me in this book. I mean, that's the spine of it in some ways, is the attempt to find a way to evoke in oneself the quality of attention that we call love. There's a moment in the book where the young woman who's the sound person in the film crew takes the mic off him and moves it and all. And, you know, he's in his late 70s and he's ill, and he's you know, he's lost half his body weight. He's in a wheelchair, and this very young 20-something-year-old woman brushes up close to him and in an intimate way to remove the microphone. And he pays incredible attention to her. And it's not lust of any sort. It's just like her physical presence is incredibly powerful to him. And then he reflects from there. And that's a passage that I actually like. I mean, one doesn't like to say that one likes particular passages in one's book, but that's the one where he reflects. He says, if I had paid that kind of attention to my first wife, and to my second, and to my children, my life would have been totally different. I would have been able to love them.
There is a point where you write, if he dies without having told her, Emma, his wife, having told her the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, then she'll have loved and married and been the 40-year partner of a purely fictional character. That's fascinating to me, because you seem to play with that throughout the novel, of this idea of what is true, what is memory, what is not true, what we have told ourselves, what we believe, what we don't believe. And those are all fascinating, especially as you mentioned earlier in this character, because it's an adult brain as well.
Yeah, it's terribly important to the book, and it became important to me a few years ago. I mean, this is a book I don't think I could have written when I was younger for various reasons. But one of them is that a man I very much loved in his last years was suffering from dementia. And as a result, he was confabulating. I had never experienced that up close before. I'd never seen someone confabulate, where they bring together into a narrative that is utterly believable to themselves, that's made of memory and of fantasy and of dreams and of movies they may have seen, of things that actually happened, in which time collapses and things that happened 50 years ago seem to be happening today, and so on. That confabulation is an extraordinary mental state, and familiar to most of us who have been close to or know people who suffered from dementia or Alzheimer's, or it also happens under medication and other conditions like that, and I started trying to imagine what that must be like, where it's totally believable to him. And his narrative, as he tries to explain what he's experiencing, what he's remembering, and what he thinks is true about his life, makes no sense to the listener. And so how do you present that in a novel where you're saying the subjective experience of the character is totally coherent to him, but rather incoherent, almost utterly incoherent to the listener to whom he's speaking. And I realized as I tried to imagine that and tried to understand that in this person that I loved so much, it was what it was like. It was so close to what I think of as fiction writing. This is what a fiction writer does, brings together and confabulates. I mean, it's with fabulation, confabulate. And I began to think, this is how I write my books and how I think when I'm writing fiction. And so I integrated that insight into the novel. And there are, as you point out, there are moments and cues and places where another critic called it metatextuality, where there is a kind, yeah, right, but there is a kind of self-consciousness, certainly on my part, where I'm saying, I know this is how it is to write fiction. This is how it is to confabulate. This may be how it is to die.
Russell Banks is our guest on this week's book show. The new novel is FOREGONE. Much of the idea behind the novel, of course, is that Leonard is one of the 60,000 draft evaders and deserters who fled to Canada to avoid serving in Vietnam. You tell us in the first chapter that is the story that ultimately is being told to the documentary filmmakers, but obviously for Leonard there is a twist to that. What brought you to that fact that 60,000 individuals and wanting to explore that and have that at times very much in the foreground, but certainly almost always in the background?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a factor in my own life in some ways, going back to the 60s, when I was part of the opposition to the war, first in Chapel Hill, and then later when I returned to New Hampshire in the late 60s, early 70s. And I knew many people moving through that particular channel. I mean, they were in flight, and I knew people who were advising them and helping them escape into Canada. So that was a factor, and there are other factors too, I suppose, involved. One is that it's partly a forgotten episode in American history, and a rather dramatic and interesting and unique one. Not since, in a way, the Revolutionary War, when loyalists fled to Canada to escape the new republic, have that many Americans gone north, and so that was important to me. And I am myself Canadian and Canadian American. My father's Canadian. 3 of my grandparents are Canadian. And I've lived most of my adult life on the borders of the border of Canada, in the Northeast, in New Hampshire, and here now in upstate New York. So it's that part of it drew me as well toward this particular aspect of the story. And then too, he's a man in his late 70s looking back to that era and trying to understand it. And so are most of my generation. So is most of my generation. trying to figure it out. When you're in your 70s, what the hell was going on when you were in your 20s? And you know, you're approaching your own mortality face on, and long ago, you didn't even occur to you that that was going to be the drama of your life, your own mortality. The final story was going to be the story, and I began to get that. A number of I'm of a certain age, obviously. I'm about in a couple of weeks be 81, and so most of my contemporaries, my generation, and many of my closest friends, you know, have been dying, and so mortality, my mortality, was inescapable, and it had to become a major subject. And when that becomes a major subject, then so does your youth, so does how you got here become a major subject. I mean, I know it's a particular kind of book. And it has the long view. But at the moment, at this point in my own personal life, that's sort of the only view I think is available to me.
What is so fascinating, though, is that for the filmmakers, for those who want to know more about Leonard's life, they're asking questions about that larger issue of going to Canada, as well as his films and what he saw and what he got on film at any given time. And those are the questions they want to ask. Those are the questions on those cards. And as I mentioned, he has his own ideas, but his story eclipses that, because there's so much, even as a young man, by the time he gets to Canada, has lived a hell of a life.
Yeah. Right. No, that's true, and of course that's true for all of us. But I wanted to make that the driving drama of his story, not what happened after he got to Canada, but what happened before he got to Canada, and how and why he went there. And I you know, I hope that is clear, and I hope that that's also dramatically engaging and interesting as well, and revealing too. I mean, as I said, I'm at an age now where I look back and I say, what is more responsible for my character, the shape of my life, the relations that I treasure in my life. What's more responsible for that than those early years? And so you're forced to examine them again and go back and look at them closely and evaluate them as much as possible from this distance.
I think it is also interesting that film is such a part of this. I know your interest in film. I know that you have spent many years with film festivals and working in and around that. So that also is something that comes very much as to, we are told throughout the book that the power of editing. We can take this story. You can tell Leonard, you can talk all you want. You can talk for 2.5 hours. You can tell us this. This may end up being 7 minutes on screen, maybe.
Right. Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, I've been very fortunate in my work with filmmakers, and a couple of them have particularly helped out with this book. I sent a copy of the manuscript early on to Adam Agoyan, who made the film The Sweet Hereafter, and asked him, and he's Canadian too, which helped, and said, can you vet this for me? Will you, just go make sure I got the details correct, and so on. And another filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, Denny Mueller, I asked him also to vet it and look through it and make sure that I was presenting a filmmaker's film, a novel, that it would not violate, any of their sense of the reality of what they do. And they were both very helpful. And indeed, I changed a few things as a result of their help. But I was also very interested in that process of editing. That is such a fascinating aspect to filmmaking, and very close to what a novelist does in revision, and going back over and reshaping a narrative. There's a marvelous book by by Michael Ondaatje and Walter Murch, who's Martin Scorsese's, Coppola's DP, director of photography for many years, and it's a book published, I think, in Canada, but it's a great book about a filmmaker talking to a fiction writer about how common and how interesting their process is. But the filmmaker is an editor, not a director, and that's really interesting and important. Another aspect of filmmaking, which I know informed this too, is that years ago in the 90s, when I was first getting deeply involved in filmmaking, and it was in the making of Affliction and the making of The Sweet Hereafter, and I was hanging out with actors and directors and DPs and so forth, and I had thought up to that point that the novelist is closest to a director, because you're in charge, you're the main man, the main woman, this is your project, etc. And I began to realize slowly, no, novelists are more like actors, because I realized actors embody the characters. They get inside the characters and look out their eyes. And that's really what it is also to be a novelist, is that you get inside the character and you look out through their eyes. You don't really know what it's like to be in the same room with them any more than you know what it's like to be in the same room with yourself. But you do know what it's like to be in the same room with all these other people. So I saw closely the parallel between them. And so that leads me to the analogy, I suppose, between Leonard Fife, who was inside himself looking out, trying to externalize himself, trying to make himself known with the greatest of difficulty. And to do that, you just got to give up the secret self in order to make that possible. So there are a lot of serious and intentional, and some not so intentional, parallels to filmmaking in this, as there are a lot of serious, intentional, and not so intentional parallels to writing novels in this as well. And then I suppose too, there's a great deal in it that is an attempt to show, dramatize, and live with the difficulties and the profound meaning of love between a man and a woman, or any two human beings.
Russell Bangs is our guest. The book is Foregone. You mentioned this earlier about your Canadian roots, as well as wanting the Canadian perspective on it as you were working on this. How do you think this is landing in Canada?
Well, gee, I spent a lot of time the last week talking to Canadian journalists. They seem to really be grabbing at it, and I'm grateful for it in many ways, in as much as it points to a historical aspect of Canada that has gotten rather little attention, both in Canada and in the United States. And particularly the development of Agent Orange in Canada. That's a big series of episodes there, a film that Leonard Fife made about the involvement of Canadian government and Canadian military in developing Agent Orange during the Vietnam era, even as they were happily welcoming 60,000 American deserters and draft dodgers into Canada. So they're glad to hear that story being told. And today I was talking to a journalist in Montreal, and was much of this novel is set in Montreal, and you always get nervous when you're talking to a journalist who owns the territory that you're talking to, and if you screwed up an address or any little detail, he's going to jump or she's going to jump all over you. And I was very grateful that he said, "No, you really got exactly the right details. You got it right. That's Sherbrooke. I know that block. I know that place, and so forth and so on." And so it's very gratifying, I must say. Small pleasures for a novelist.
There, as we wrap up, one of the things that I loved too is just this. You seem to really work through the idea that there's such tension in that room of what is going on, and there are people who are trying to alleviate it. There are people who are adding to it. Everyone's trying to work with Leonard, but there is such tension. And as you say, we know the guy's going to die too. So there's that tension, and yet while I started my first question to you is what is this despicable character, but it's also a lovely story. And there's just those gentle moments as well through that great tension.
I hope so. I like to think that the character of the Haitian nurse, Renee Jacques, is a way for that to happen. His interrelations with her, which opens with her wheeling his wheelchair out into the black box of the room where they're going to be filming it. And his ongoing dialogue with her, and she's caring for him, of course, in the most intimate ways, and she has a kind of I think beautiful detachment where she both loves him almost. I mean, she's caring for him. She humanizes him. He's a human being to her. He may be a famous leftist documentary filmmaker to the world, but to her, he's a dying man and her patient, and she's taking care of him. And I hope there's an important kind of transaction goes on between the two of her, and she functions in the novel to me sort of like a Greek chorus in a way. She's he's unreliable, the people around him are unreliable, but she is clearly reliable. Her perspective on it is the real one, the final one. And that's why we end the novel with her. With at the very end, we follow her out of that black box and out of that apartment and out into the street of Montreal, where she starts then thinking about her husband and her son and her two grandkids and her son's new wife. And, she's in another world then. And we are, I hope, carried out of that world of Leonard Fyfe with her. But she's an important person in the story.
Well, it's such a beautiful novel. It is FOREGONE. It is published by Echo. Russell Banks, it's always a great pleasure to have you on our program. I thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's been great to be with you again.
We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. This show was recorded as part of a virtual author event with Northshire Bookstore, northshire.com. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening. For The Book Show, I'm Joe Donahue. Well, that was terrific. Thank you.
Now you can be Joe Donahue at the Northshire. Right?
Yeah, I know. That's great. Now I can swear and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we have a lot of questions. So if you are ready, we can get to them.
Sure.
Let's see. This from this is from Tom. It seems there might be some parallels between Mr. Banks's station and time of life and the protagonist. Might you consider asking what, if any, of the issues you raise are him working vicariously through his own choices?
Yeah, that's it's clear. I hope, I assume that it's clear that this is a book that I wouldn't have imagined writing when I was younger, or even a few years younger. But as I approached 80 and now beyond, it's obviously an inescapable fact of my life, my own mortality. And as I mentioned earlier, so many of my dear lifelong friends have died over the course of the last few years, that it's something I had to address and had to come back and imagine and say, okay, let's deal. Let's do it and not turn away from it. And try to imagine what it's like to be dying, and even to the point of death. And so the book was motivated very much by that, and no question. I couldn't and I wouldn't have bothered or thought to write this book when I was younger.
Julie asks a great question, and I say it's a great question because it was one that I thought of too, and I'm glad she asked it, because she does a much better job than I would have. You're writing without quotation marks, or even, he said, and flowing between narrative and dialogue. It seems to work very well, but what are the technical considerations to make that work? And that was the artistic reason for that.
Right. There were, I don't know how artistic one might think of it as, but I was trying to get the closest possible third person point of view that I could achieve, and make it subjective as much as possible without making it a first person narrative. It had to be third person because I had to keep switching from one set of characters to another, and I wanted their perspective as well as his perspective. But I wanted it intimate and subjective, and it seemed that quotation marks objectified and turned it out into the bigger world, the objective world. Without the quotation marks, we enter into the mind of the character more closely. It's close third person, and which is not a peculiar point of view, but it's a very useful one when you're trying to switch perspective from one character to the next, and you really want to reveal the interior life of your character, but you don't want to rely on a first person narrative in order to do it. So that's the reason for leaving it out. And a sort of a corollary to your question too is, why then did you decide to use quotation marks in the last chapter, which I did. Yeah, that's the last chapter is really told from then you're moving out of the story at the last chapter because he has died. You know, there is nothing more to say in a way except to follow out of the story on the heels of the nurse of Renee, who leaves the building, leaves the room, goes out into the world, the outside exterior objective world. And so it's a different point of view then. It's no longer subjective, it's more objective and distance. And I was trying to sort of move from a very intimate close-up shot, as to use cinematic terms, close-up, to a long range shot where you move back and out and the characters. So quotation marks managed to do that for me by introducing them at the very end.
Right, and the ending, the very ending. I mean, that is a cinematic ending, which is fascinating. Russ writes and says, my first reading of your work was Continental Drift, and your treatment of Haitian refugees still resonates today with the plight of Syrians escaping to Europe and Central Americans trying to reach the US. Could you comment on a similar ongoing theme in your work featuring white working class characters who feel and are marginalized?
Well, yeah, it's almost in some ways more crucial to me to think about and try to imagine today than it was back there in 1982 and 3 when I was writing Continental Drift. The Reagan years, remember them? And I was trying to imagine what it was like to be a working class stiff trying to improve your life in the United States, or what it was like to be an impoverished and desperate person living in this case in Haiti or any number of other places trying to get to the United States. And but here we are today, and I find myself still worrying myself over these exact questions. It's a constant, I guess, in some ways. But right now, I know I've been writing stories lately. After I finished this novel, I did another one, and now I'm writing stories where I'm trying to understand as well as I can people who have supported Donald Trump, for instance, over the last 5 years or so, and really trying to understand them because they're my neighbors. And many of my friends in upstate New York and up in the Adirondacks, where Chase and I spend most of our summer months. And these are people I like and I know are decent human beings, and I want to understand it, that phenomenon, and figure it out. You know, you don't write fiction because you understand something. You write fiction because something is a mystery to you, something you don't understand. And the only way you can come to an understanding of it is through the process of writing fiction. So it is something I'm still trying to struggle with and understand.
I think many of us are. Tom writes and says, young men who did or might have fought in Vietnam had elaborate thoughts about death. For the novel, did you think about how a younger person's conception of death is different from someone older?
Oh, gee, that's tough. I don't think I did, to be honest, perfectly honest. I don't think I thought about it. I thought about how I thought about death when I was younger and compared it to how I do now, certainly. And what was important to me then versus what is important to me now. But I didn't think about it in a more general sense than that. And I'm not sure that I should. I think I think about it in terms of my children, certainly, and other young people that I know personally and I'm deeply attached to, and so on. What do they think about it? But I don't really think about it too much in a general way.
A question that I have been that I've enjoyed asking authors over the past several months is, given the solitary nature of the profession of being a writer, of writing and you in that room, what has the pandemic how has the pandemic impacted and affected the way you work, the schedule, and even creatively impacted your work?
Yeah, I think it's had, I hate to admit it, but I think it's had a very positive impact on me. I mean, it's reinforced my solitude, which and removed distractions and you know, ways in which I might avoid writing. I'm stuck here now in this room. You can see here, this is my bunker. This is I'm down here in my studio where I work, and I don't have any other place to go during the day except here. And so I'm here oftentimes even till very late at night. And it's produced, as a result, it's been the most productive year of my life. Really, I've never written as much. I like to think that I'm writing as well as I ever have, and so it's been very positive in that sense. By the same token, of course, I've had to retreat into my private mind more than I have in the past, and that's I don't know if that's good or bad, but it hasn't been harmful for me as a writer. You know, and I'm very fortunate in that I don't have to concern myself too deeply about how can I afford this financially, and also you know, my health is good, and so I'm not too afraid. And so it's all in some ways been positive, even as it's been obviously a national and international, a worldwide tragedy. I'm very conscious of that, but personally and privately, it's enforced a kind of solitude that I only had to in the past will, and now I don't have to will it; it's imposed upon me.
Is there a feeling of because of the tragic nature of it, because of 500,000 of our fellow Americans have died because of at the hands of this pandemic? Is there a like a mood of the room kind of thing that is a pall or a wet blanket that is there that wouldn't be there normally?
I don't know. I've always been slightly morbid anyhow, and
so this just helps.
I didn't need much to emphasize it or develop it. It's always been there, and so I don't know. I think that it has engaged me in the world in a more compassionate and sad way than I had before. This loss, 500,000 people, and this just in the United States, and all across the world. It's catastrophic, and I, in my lifetime, have never had to deal with anything quite this catastrophic. Maybe if I had gone through World War I up close in Europe or something like that, or who knows, there are other things we can point to that might have that same impact, but it does have an impact. It's a thunderclap in your heart that just comes on, and you just stop, you stop and listen and look, and you want to weep.
I want to thank you so much for spending time with us. I want to thank all the folks who joined us tonight, and of course, those who asked questions. I think we got to all of them. And I thank you for being so great and gracious and such a wonderful storyteller, and for sharing with us, and just to know that you're in our backyard as an added plus. So blessings to you, and I thank you so much, and we'll turn it back to our Northshire hosts.
All right. Thank you, Joe, so much.
Thank you, Russell.
I wanted to chime in with my thanks. This evening has been truly lovely. A real pleasure to get to start the weekend with such wise words and lovely conversation. So thank you both for your time tonight, Russell and Joe. Audience, the book is Foregone, and you can order it at northshire.com. The link was in the chat and is also in the confirmation email you got from Eventbrite, so you can order it there. And we'll see you all next time at another Northshire Live.
All right, great.
Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.